Joining me in the studio is Eva Bailey, partner for Anderson's Solicitors. Hello, Eva.
Hello, Sonya.
Great to have you along. Now, just before 3 o'clock, I said how to make divorce easier. Now, that's not what I meant. That was a very bad way to talk about this topic. The thing is, we're not trying to make divorce easier. We're just saying if you're down that path, what are the things you need to know to make it as painless as possible, I guess?
I think that's right. It's always going to be a difficult time in someone's life, but there are top tips that you can know in order to help you through that time. And that's why I've written a blog recently on our Anderson site about that.
Okay, so when it comes to heading down the divorce path, how early on should we be starting to think about that word divorce?
I guess that depends on the situation and it's probably different for everyone. But in terms of when you should get some proper advice about it, I would say quite early. Some people come to see us before they are divorcing or separating, and that doesn't mean that we're going to encourage them down that path. In fact, we might discourage them from it. But it's just to get an idea of what their legal entitlements are and how they might navigate that separation from their former partner to make things smoother for them and their children.
Now, as a lawyer, I'm sure you've heard it before, that people say, of course you'll say get in early because there's that saying that the only people that benefit from divorce are lawyers.
Of course, and we're hearing that more and more in the media, and the judges are making comments about legal fees and how much it's costing people. And as lawyers, we are concerned about that too. We really want to help people, and we do say get in early, and of course that does provide us profit as a business, but that's not the reason we say it. We say it because if you get in early, you can avoid situations and circumstances that might get you in trouble with the law later on if your matter doesn't end nicely.
So explain a little bit about the sorts of, can you just come along and get some advice without actually engaging a lawyer as such?
Yes, most firms offer some process for having initial interviews, and we certainly do. And most lawyers are happy to talk to people about any sort of matter really early on and to give them some idea about how the process works, what the cost might be, and how to provide your lawyer with the information they need to help you with the advice that you require.
Can you only get that information from a lawyer, or are there public services available where you might be able to get that information?
I think in terms of family law and divorce and separating, a lot of the time people will go early on to a mediator through organisations like Centrecare and things like that. I would say, again, it's important to know what your legal entitlements are, and it's probably only a lawyer that can really let you know how the Family Law Act works.
And with your makeup of family, presumably, because there are so many different ones.
That's right. We say each case is individual, and you need to know how to apply the law to each person's situation.
At later dates, we'll take a look at things like property and children and how that factors into the whole D-word type situation. But let's take a look in more general terms. And this isn't official legal advice. This is just the sort of things you need to know if you're heading down that divorce path. And you might be someone who's travelled that path before. Perhaps you can relate your experiences, or maybe you have a question. Feel free to give Eva a ring, 1300 222 891. You can also text us on 0467 922 891. She can't give your personal advice, but if you have a question of a general nature and what that might mean legally, then feel free to give us a ring. So let's take a look at some of the things you need to know on the divorce front, Eva.
So yes, talking about acting in your children's best interests. I mean, obviously for a parent, they're always going to try to do that, or we would hope so anyway. But in terms of the law, that is the most important consideration under the Family Law Act. And if a matter ends up in a court, the court's going to look back at people's behaviour after they separate and how they've interacted with their children and their former partner, and they're going to make some judgments about that. So it's important that we put their interest first, and that moves on to being careful what you post on social media. Social media is obviously something that we've got around these days, and it's something that's still relatively new in some terms, and people put all sorts of things on social media. It might just be what they're doing with their children that weekend, and that's fine. We all like to do that. But if that's something that the other party might find offensive or take some issue with, it might end up on the back of a court document, and that might end up with you being in a bit of trouble. So unfortunately, once you separate, you need to think about the actions you're taking and how they might be perceived.
Even if they seem innocuous to you, it's actually about how they're perceived.
That's right.
Not
quite
what
right.
the intention was.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously, beyond that, people also put nasty things on social media about the situation they're going through, about their former partner and things like that. And again, that can be often seen by anyone else. You might have blocked your former partner, but you might have mutual friends and the like, and it often ends up being given to lawyers and ending up in a court, unfortunately, if that's where your matter ends up.
Yeah. My guest is Eva Bailey. She's a partner with Anderson's Solicitors, as we take a look at some of the tips that you should take on board if you are, sadly, and we know that this time of year is a big one for this for separations, if you're heading down the road to divorce. How early, and you said early to get advice, but is it too early to start making demands as to who gets what?
Yes, I think, again, it probably depends on the situation and the urgency, if someone's needing to move out and they need to take some things with them and those kind of things. But you do need to think about these things and navigate that process. Sometimes people are able to discuss that between themselves quite amicably, and then lawyers might draw up some record of what they've agreed. In other cases, people will need advice literally to write down the things that they are requiring from the other person and to negotiate that with them. It depends, I guess, on the level of communication that they're still able to have once they've decided that the relationship is over.
Okay, so keep your children's best interests at heart. Be careful what you're doing publicly and what information you're releasing out there. You say you should secure your data and finances. Why?
Yes, I think that's something that people often forget when they're in the midst of a very emotional period in their lives. It's important that you change your passwords on your email, on your net banking, on your social media so that you can protect yourself. It's important to look after your finances and think about joint accounts and whether you want to try to prevent money coming out of them. Obviously, the family home still needs the mortgage paid and you wouldn't want to necessarily take steps to mess around with that, and that's something we talk to people about. But it's often the case that you should contact your bank and talk about joint accounts and making them both must sign and those kind of things, because otherwise, after the fact, once the money's been taken out, it's a lot harder to get it back than to stop it from moving in the first place.
Well, that's true. I guess if you both have access to a financial account, you don't have to stymie anything, but you both have to still agree to that money coming out.
That's right.
Or separate them.
Yes, correct.
Completely. What happens with liability in those senses? Are you still accountable for bills and
yes,
all of that jointly even after you've separated?
Yes, those are things that people need to work out, and sometimes they need help with that. In terms of your mortgage, the bank is certainly going to hold you both still liable for that debt, and similar for other joint debts. In terms of your own debts, you're going to need to manage those. Bills can be an issue as to when someone moved out and how much they should contribute to those and things like that. Often the person left in the home might get left with the bills, but it depends whose name the bills are in, and at the end of the day, all of that needs to be taken into account when people divide their property down the track when they work out those financial divisions.
Anna has given us a call. She says, make sure you have a car registered in your name or you won't be able to keep it. I'm not sure about that, but I guess this all comes together with finances and possessions and who uses what and who owns what.
Yes, I think at the end of the day, the Family Law Act and the law isn't as concerned about whose names property and assets like cars are in. Just because the car's not in your name doesn't mean you can't keep it, but you might come up with some practical difficulties in terms of re-registering it and those kind of things if you haven't already dealt with that before you separate. Speeding fines and things like that might be a bit of an issue too if you get speeding fines in the other person's name or vice versa. So it's a practical step to consider. You may still well be able to keep the home or the car or another asset when it's not in your name, but it's something that would need to be negotiated.
Get some financial advice is one of your suggestions. A lawyer suggesting, well, the finances are the big part of it, how you make it work when you're when you're no longer a couple.
Yes, that's quite right. I mean, some of our clients find themselves without an income and without a home and things like that, and it's important that they get some advice early on about how they're going to manage their financial situation. Also, for example, if someone's wanting to keep a house, can they afford to keep it? Can they afford to pay their former partner out from the asset pool and keep the house? And those kind of questions are what's important to get some financial advice on.
This texter says, I've only known one couple divorce well. If you could take emotion out of it, it would be easy.
I'd have to agree. I like to think that we don't see all of the couples that divorce. I think there are a lot of couples who do sort it out themselves, but we always recommend they come to us and get their agreement drawn up so they're protected from any future claim. Some parties do come into us and ask us to do that for them, and they've already worked it out themselves. But then as lawyers, we obviously see the cases where people simply can't sort it out and need help to do so.
One of the things you advise people to do, I mean, getting legal advice initially, although you said that doesn't have to be ongoing, it's just sort of a one-off visit to know where you stand legally, get that advice, and then go off and do it and just get it signed off later. You said get financial advice, so you sort that one out. Get counselling. Why counselling?
I think that comes as well from your texter mentioning emotion. When people are really emotional, it's hard for them to make rational decisions and sensible decisions for their future. And a lot of our clients are damaged by way of their broken relationship and what they've been through. So we find a lot of them leaning on us as lawyers to counsel them, and obviously we're really not qualified to do that.
That's not your expertise.
No, we're happy to listen to people and give them some empathy and where we can. But if they can see a professional about getting that counselling, that can help them get their emotions on the right track so that they can give us better instructions to give them better advice and help them through that time.
So do you find that one of the problems is that because people are overwrought and emotional, that they're not always making sensible decisions?
That's exactly right. People are so upset by their situation and by many things that have led to their separation that it's hard for them to look past that into the future and what they need to set up for themselves and their children.
And so that can have the fallout in the how you present to your kids, how you present publicly, how that might play out down the track should it ever go to court, those sorts of things.
That's right. And then you end up trying to explain the behaviour, maybe rather than getting some help early on and trying to avoid that.
Yeah. You also suggest getting all your relevant financial information together. What sort of things are you talking about and why is that of benefit?
So when you look at dividing a person's property, you need to work out what they own and how they're going to divide it. And part of that process is obtaining all of your relevant documents to share with the other party so that you both have the full picture, and it's a requirement that that happen. So things like bank statements, tax returns, superannuation statements and other documents that set out the assets that you have and the income that you each receive is important.
Not everyone has access to their partner's super, for instance, or perhaps some of those details you're talking about.
That's right. So early on in the property division type matters, parties can ask for that from the other person. Ultimately, it might end up with a lawyer asking for that from the other lawyer. But disclosure of documents is a requirement that both parties exchange those documents as part of that process. So while you might not have access to their documents, you are entitled to ask for them and be provided with them.
See, that's all important information, isn't it? Because a lot of people just go, it's all too hard, I just want to get out of there. The other person can have it all.
Yes, we do get a bit of that, and we try to encourage people to get through that time and to think sensibly about that and to look at a time in the future when they're not going to feel like that anymore and to protect themselves. So it is important. A lot of our clients really don't have a lot of idea about what's happening with the finances in their relationship. So they will come to us and need us to ask for that information from their former partner or from the former partner's lawyer so that they can have an idea of the assets and liabilities. They might have really no idea what they owned as a couple at the end of their relationship otherwise.
If you're listening to this, maybe you've been down the separation road, heading to divorce in the past. What are the things you found important? How much of this is resonating with you? 1300 222 891. You can also text us on 0467 922 891. Look, as we highlighted, someone says, you're making it sound so easy. Why has Australia got the most expensive divorce situation in the world? I know people who have taken 2 to 3 years for settlement and it's cost thousands. Why? It's a feast for the lawyers.
I think that's a fair question, Sonya, and there's a few different reasons for that. Sometimes you just get really nasty personalities in separations that we as lawyers can't control, and when there's so much emotion, as we were talking about, sometimes there is spite and revenge that people want to get, and they simply can't look past that to what's best for them or their children, and that makes it difficult for everyone. And I think that's one of the main reasons for that. It is a process and it takes some time. Our courts are very busy. There's a bit of a lack of funding and lawyers are often asking the government to add more funding to the family courts because it is taking people some months to get into court for hearings and then many more months before there's a final decision on their matter. So there's a number of reasons for that, and as lawyers, we don't want to see that. We want to see people's matters finished as quickly for people as possible because it is a difficult time and the sooner it's finalised and they can move forward, the better.
Yeah. Getting a couple of questions about specifics on things like property and kids and that sort of thing. And we're going to look at that over the next couple of weeks where we get into the sort of nitty-gritty of those things a bit more. Today it's a little bit more general, but this texter says, if I'm paying my parents' mortgage, would that amount be excluded? When it comes to property development, and we see often complex arrangements, is it that sort of thing that you need to get the early advice on?
That's right. That sort of thing needs to be dealt with early and get some advice on it. And also it may need to be taken into account in terms of your final property division. Contributions by either party into the relationship and expenditures out of the relationship are some of the things that are looked at in a property division.
Yeah. Well, there are time limits on certain things as well. So getting that advice and knowing that up front, I guess, is really important as well. So overall, when we talk about this general thing, what do you think the most important thing is that people need to think about when it comes to heading down this path?
I think that people need to think about the decision they're making and whether it is the right decision for them and for their children. Ultimately, a lot of them feel they have no choice at the end, and if that's the decision they're making, then that might be the case that they need to make that decision. But it is an arduous process, or it can be, and an emotional one. So I don't think separation.
So don't be under any illusions about how difficult it might be.
It shouldn't be taken lightly. And when you do it, I think be prepared if you can be. Look at some of the tips I've mentioned on the blog and get some advice early on, because then you can best protect yourself and your children.
Before we finish up, Eva, just a couple of specific questions. Anne says, what is collaborative divorce?
Collaborative divorce involves particular lawyers that practice in collaborative law. They tend to work with financial advisors and try to come a round table-like discussion to mediate a situation.
So it's not as adversarial, is that what you're saying?
That's the idea of it, yes. And there's various forms of that. There are collaborative practitioners. There are practitioners who endeavour to do mediation before any proceedings or negotiations, and that's something we all try to do. So there's various ways of collaborating.
So is that trying to get the best for both parties, not acting on behalf of just one?
You still need to have separate lawyers acting for the parties, but it's an agreement by both parties at the start to enter into a collaborative approach rather than a hostile approach to their situation.
Okay, and this texter says, are inherited monies protected for the entitled person?
Yes, that's a big one that we deal with, and the answer is not clear, but there is something you would get advice on. Inherited monies are a contribution by that person into the relationship. It depends when they're received, what you do with them, how you deal with them, whether or not they are excluded. Obviously, as you can understand, the person receiving them wants to exclude them, and the person who hasn't received them would like them included, and there's often a disagreement about that. It's something your lawyers normally have to help you work out.
Okay, so the answer is maybe.
That's right.
Eva Bailey, thanks so much for your time. Eva Bailey is a partner with Anderson Solicitors, and she'll be back over the next couple of weeks getting more specific. We'll do property perhaps next, and then we'll do children, because they're two very specific areas of divorce and what that needs to involve.